Okay. Okay, this next chapter is on pruning, trees, shrubs, palms. And Mark and I, actually, Mark and Steve Nims would normally do this, but Steve's on vacation. So I'm going to try to fill in, and Mark, I'll do this first part here on a little bit of the plant anatomy part, plant biology, and then Mark will do the real part on pruning. So some of these slides, well, actually a lot of these slides were put together by Steve in his warped sense of humor. We'll deal with that. Okay, here again, this is all in your book. You might want to turn to that chapter again on pruning. We don't need time to just read verbatim every here, but these are the course objectives for pruning. Going through some of the qualifications that we've already gone through yesterday pretty quickly, and what is pruning and so forth. We're going to concentrate a lot on safety, pruning procedures to reduce tree risk and improve health, and some of the guidelines. And then also making the proper cuts. Qualifications again here, specific to tree trimming. Arborist, well, first of all, a C27 or C27A contractor's license. Have to have workman's comp liability, all that, in order to be a private contractor. Just a business license is basically what it amounts to. You have to have one ISA certified arborist in your employ. 2 Western Chapter ISA certified tree workers, minimum. Proper employment documents, again, you have to be a legal alien, not preferably, but the supervisor has to speak English and communicate with English-speaking people. Understanding all of the pruning standards, the ANSI 300.1 standards, which there is an entire manual, right, Mark, for these that's available. The Z, safety standards and so forth. All of these are requirements before the bid can be let.
They're also including a performance bond with a lot of the new contracts. So that's something else that's another way to enforce the contract. So in the past, when a contractor wasn't able to perform, it was difficult to get rid of them because the money was only allocated to that company and nobody else, they would have a dead time if they got rid of them. In the future, that performance bond will take over. The next person in line then will be paid by the way of the performance bond. And then the company that lost that performance bond will have a very difficult time in the future to get money in.
And that's new, right? Yeah. Enforcement, at least, is new. Okay, just a little bit about maybe the science of pruning. What is pruning? It's just, of course, removing parts of the plant, selectively removing parts of the plants. Pruning normally refers to trees and shrubs, where mowing would refer to grass, but it's a similar, kind of a thing. But with pruning, like in mowing, you're doing it for a particular reason. You're not pruning it just because you want to take off half the tree. There has to be a legitimate reason for pruning trees and shrubs. If you look at the way, did we ever come up with a plant? I guess not. If you look at the way trees grow, the growing point on any plant, on any tree or shrub, is from the tip, this little terminal bud right here. And that little tip continues to put out more stem, and it continues to grow up this way. The area down below here, further down the stem, like down in here, this area is all finished growing. It doesn't get any longer. So some people think of trees kind of growing up out of the ground. If a branch is this high here, 10 years from now it's going to be way up here because the tree's coming up out of the ground. But that's not the way any plant would grow. It's always from the tip. That's called the primary growth and going up and out. And that's only from the end of the branches. There's a special little bud here called the terminal bud. So that's one thing to keep in mind. When you prune, you want to make your pruning cut somewhere near one of these little bud areas here. This is a lateral bud that has a leaf, and this little bud here could be a stem or a flower or another leaf, but this area here is called the node. And that's where you want to make, just right above that node is where you want to make your pruning cuts. Even on a larger branch, you can find these areas where you want to make your cut back to another branch, smaller branch, or if it's a small shrub like this, back to a node, because that's where the new growth is going to come from. If you cut it up in here, above that too far, you'll just leave a stump, which could decay, right? And all the new growth is going to come from these buds anyway. But very quickly, what happens here, the importance of this a terminal bud is that it makes a chemical. It's a plant hormone. And it remains the main growing point of the stem, and all these other lower buds here down below, this chemical moves down the stem and it stops these lower buds from developing. So they'll stay dormant for a period of time. As the stem continues to grow up, some of these older stems now further away from that tip are no longer influenced as much by this chemical moving down, so they'll start to pop out, and you'll get branches starting to pop down below here. And each one of these branches has its own terminal bud that does the same thing. It'll start continuing to grow from a bud like this. It'll grow into a branch, and it'll get longer from here to here to here to here. So these branches all now begin to branch out, and the tree will fill in. If you remove this lateral bud here, this top bud, if you take it back down to, say, right in here, that temporarily removes that inhibition of the chemical here, and all these buds here will start to break out, and the tip of the branch gets real full. That's what you want to do when you're just pruning out shrubbery to make them fill in. You want to be pruning back to these nodes here, taking off sometimes just the tip itself will cause the tip of that branch then to fill out and fill in. So that's when you're doing, especially shrubbery, that's what you're looking for, is to fill in, cut it back and make it fill in dense. Trees the same way, except a little bit more difficult to identify these buds and so forth. So that's one thing. When branches grow this way, sideways, here again, here's this leading apical bud. When this happens, that chemical that normally, it just moves by gravity, that chemical that moves, that's a hormone, moves down the stem this way to stop the growth all here. It'll collect at the bottom of the stem because of gravity, it pulls it down. So in that case, it'll stop these shoots underneath from developing, but you get these guys going up straight, and what often happens here is when you trim a limb like this, and all of that chemical no longer is there, you get a lot of these guys going up. They're called water shoots, and you know how fast they grow real quick. Yeah, they're not necessarily good either. In trees and stuff, that's one of the things you want to remove, are these water shoots, because they grow very quickly. The actual angle of the branch too will influence how branches on either side develop. Branches on the underside, if you've got a branch here at 45, branches on the underside are not influenced as much as branches on the upper side, so you get those growing a little bit more differently, a little bit higher. So branch angles actually do affect. We'll talk a little bit more about the actual angle of the branch in a little bit. So getting back to when you're doing pruning, there should be a logical reason that you're pruning that tree. If it doesn't need anything, then there's no reason to prune it. Over pruning is not good either, so you should have a plan. Effective pruning, now Mark can probably go into this a little bit more, but effective pruning is looking at the tree, getting an idea of what needs to be done, and then going in and just doing that. Mark, you have a quick comment on planning that, or is there a special rule or anything?
Yeah, what structure of a tree is critically important for safety in an urban setting. So it's really important that when trees are young, if you see any defective things going on in the tree, to remove it earlier. Trees can heal or actually compartmentalize because they really don't heal. They don't regenerate cells like we do. but they can actually recoup from pruning much better at an earlier age than a younger age. So while they're young is the time that if you see any defects, you want to take care of them, whether it's crossovers or codominant branches and things like that. So I think what this is describing is you have one central leader. To balance it off a little bit better, they're going to be removing the central leader, which when you have just one central leader, a lot of times they'll catch the wind in what they call a sail effect and be more prone to damage.
So by looking at a tree, you can kind of see what needs to be done. And like Mark says, earlier the better. If a tree is pruned on an annual basis in the first 10 years of its life, chances are it's not going to need any major pruning later on. You've taken care of all of the problems.
Little, to prune as little as possible is always better. So less is more in the situation for pruning trees.
Okay, the goals and objectives here again. This is in your manual. Some of the things to be looking at is safety issue, protecting person and property from damage due to tree limbs and so forth. Reducing risk of failure of the tree, not risk of your own failure, but risk of the tree failure, falling over, breaking off, whatever. Clearance, improving the tree structure itself, as Mark just said, pruning out to a central leader if that's necessary. Tree health, all these things here, improve the view. Now for you, that probably is going to be one of your major reasons to prune, is to improve the view at lookouts and so forth. Also signs, visibility, that kind of thing, removing limbs that are overhanging signs. And when you do that kind of pruning, there's no point in cutting a limb just in half, right? Again, you want, and we'll talk more about this, you want to go back, that limb is being taken off for a reason, You don't want it there anymore. It's going to grow back and obstruct the view. So you take it back all the way back to the trunk of the tree and then make sure it doesn't come back. Because when it does come back, it's going to cause the same problem. So things like that. A little bit about how the tree grows, the tree anatomy and the structure, and the outside, the inside. There's various parts of the tree, the roots, the stems, and the leaves. This particular slide here is talking more about the stems, the trunks, and the limbs and so forth, the above ground part of the tree. If you look at that under a microscope, you have this is actually the leaf part here. If you cut a leaf in half, it's a very, very thin leaf structure anyway, right? And it's only millimeters thick. On the top part, you usually have a protective skin or a cuticle, a waxy cuticle. On the underside of leaves, though, it's a lot different. You don't have that waxy cuticle, and you have a lot of these little pucas in here called stomates. That's this little, and there's millions of them on the underside of leaves. This is what allows oxygen and so forth to actually come out of the leaf as a result of photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide to come in, and that's mixed with water to make sugars. So this is sort of the exchange here of gases, including water vapor, from the inside of the leaf to the outside. And this is really probably, as far as pruning is concerned, one of the main things to look at, because water is drawn up through the stem, the trunk of a large tree, by the leaves. And it does that by actually sucking it up like you would a straw, and that sucking action is created by the loss of water through these stomates. Water comes up through the stem, into the leaves, and out these little holes. About 95% of all the water that moves up from the roots to the stems goes out the leaves. It's called transpiration. If you're ever in a tree, you'll find it's very humid, oftentimes on a nice, not so hot, windy day. And that's the whole driving force for moving water up a tree, are these little stomates. What happens if you prune a tree and chop off most of the leaves? Then water can't move up the stems anymore. There's nothing to draw that water up. And that's one of the main things that's so bad about topping, trees. You're taking all the leaves off. It takes a long time for the branches to come back out. There's usually a bunch of them, and leaves to develop again. In the meantime, there's no water movement at all up into the stem. So the leaves are very important in that respect. Okay, here again we're talking about the leaves again, and another importance of the leaves is it's the food manufacturing part of the plant. Leaves are green because they make that chemical called chlorophyll, and that absorbs sunlight, and through some miracle kind of a reaction, the leaf mixes carbon dioxide in the air with water coming up from the roots and sunshine, and all that turns into sugar. Only plants can do that. Nothing else. We can't do that in the laboratory even. Only plants can do that. If it wasn't, and then you know what's left over after the sugar's made? Oxygen. Animals wouldn't be here for two reasons. There wouldn't be any oxygen in the air. There wasn't any oxygen in the air until plants evolved. And also, plants are the original source of all of our food. We can't make any food, We can eat, but we don't make our food, right, like plants do. So the original source of all of our food and the oxygen in the air is directly due to plant life. So, and the part of the plant that does that, the leaves, okay? So again, another good reason for not denuding the tree by chopping most of the leaves off, you'll starve the roots, and also no water comes up, and oftentimes the tree will die. Okay, this is talking here about how the plants grow. There's actually, again, two kinds of growth of most trees. The original growth out by the terminal bud, that's called the primary growth. And then trunks and limbs get fatter, right? They grow in girth, okay? That's called the secondary growth. And that secondary growth, that trunk expansion, is due to one very thin layer. Can I have do you have any kind of a stem or anything here? Oh, there you go. All right, here you go. Good. Okay, see this? Here's a cross section of a trunk or a limb. It doesn't matter. It's all the same. See this little area right inside the bark here? Okay, that's called the cambium, and it's just a very, very thin layer of cells. That makes the wood, called the xylem, on the inside, and the barky material on the outside. And as the tree grows, that cambium kind of stretches out and gets bigger and bigger, and keeps making wood on the inside and bark on the out. But in addition to the bark, it also makes another kind of a series of tubes called phloem, which is just inside the bark, outside the cambium, in this area here, and that's where the sap moves up and down from the roots to the leaves and back and forth. The wood here is the main water conducting part of the trunk. Usually more on the outside. As the limb gets bigger and fatter, the inside of this actually gets plugged up. It's called heartwood. It'll turn darker color. And then the inside of the trunk here is more for structure, for strength, for the whole structure. And the water continues to move more on the outside. Always though, as this, year by year, this is what forms the annual rings. Each year, the limb puts down a new layer of growth, and that's what forms the rings. The wood on the inside, and the bark and the phloem on the outside. And the bark area gradually gets crushed out and replaced by the wood. Okay, so that's the basic structure of how all plants are put together. Only woody plants now have this cambium where they can get bigger and fatter. Plants that don't do that, herbaceous plants, shrubby can be woody too. Plants normally grow for 1 year, the annuals don't have that. One big difference also between these kinds of trees called dicots and others called monocots. The main difference here, say, between a monkey pod and a palm tree. Palm trees don't have this kind of a structure. Palm trees grow only from the tip, all at one time. It's got a huge bud up under at the tip of the stem. It continues to grow and put out leaves and so forth, and it gets as fat as it's going to get in that 1 year. So palm trees may broaden out a little bit at the base, as time goes on, but if you tie a tape measure, say around a coconut palm at about, say, breast height or so, it doesn't get any fatter. It stays the same all the way up. That's one of the big differences between palms and these kinds of trees. If this one is planted too close to a wall, big monkey pod, it gets fatter and fatter and fatter, and sooner or later takes out the wall. Palm tree won't do that. If it's this far away from the wall, it's good enough. It's not going to get any fatter, and now the roots may become a little bit of a problem. So that's the basic structure of the stems and the leaves. Roots are the same thing. Roots get woody too, but the major part of the root is at the very tips. Little tiny thread-like roots called root hairs are the ones that actually do all the absorbing. Okay, the way trees heal is quite a bit different than how we do. Mark, you want to do this part on showing the
Okay, remember what we were saying earlier, how trees don't heal, they compartmentalize. If you take a look at my hand and you see all the scars, I can regenerate cells to the degree. I might have some scar tissue, but okay. At the same time, I had a log a few years back hit me in the face and took out the top of my jaw along with my teeth. So it took 3 years of surgery to take bone grafts and put it over here to build it back. And then they can drill in the post. I can regenerate to a degree. I can't grow, obviously, limbs or teeth back, but I can grow a certain amount of my cells back. Trees aren't like that. When you damage a tree, it's damage for life. And that's why it's critically important for everybody to understand when you're pruning that you have to take it serious, because whatever you do to that tree will be stuck with that tree for the rest of its life. So, like Jay was saying, here we have the epidermis, the outer bark area, and the phloem. These are the vascular systems of the tree. What's the difference, the major difference between the trees and the palms are palms have a vascular system that is through a series of bundles. It doesn't have a vascular system like this per se. So there's no differentiation between the outer and inner, the phloem and xylem. So that is why you don't have an expansion of the diameter in palms versus trees. What this is a cross member of what Jay went through earlier. So again, you have the outer bark area, you have the cambium area right here, and then you have the phloem and the xylem. Port, if anybody who's ever drank wine, that's actually part of the port tree. So that's part of the actual, outer portion of the tree. Okay, what this is pertaining to, the phloem and the bark, it's to wall off. There's different areas, again, we were talking about being able to, if you have a decayed area, trees, through certain portions of the trees, can actually stop decay. And again, that's why it's really important to have areas, to know exactly where to prune. So you want to always bring it back to, like what Jay said, to a lateral. And if you're going by ANSI A300 standards, lateral is a branch, a side branch, a third of the size or more. And why that's important is because if you take it back to a side branch, a third of the size or more, that will have enough foliage on it, in theory, to be able to get that energy to stop decay through the tree. Jay brought up a good example of a tree that had a major limb off, that you could see how it travels through the tree. So from the outside, you would never know anything was wrong with that. but this is a cross section, and it traveled quite significantly through it. So, these are the type of things that you just want to be aware of. And again, if you have decay in a tree, it will never heal. It's always going to be decayed. What trees do a lot of times that you can tell for defects, that you might have an internal defect, is you'll have a swelling over here. And what that's doing, the tree is creating mass around the decayed area to support it. But you won't ever have this close up the side. So as you can tell, you'll just create more mass around this.
We can kind of skip through that if you want to.
Jay went through this, again, the different sections, the cross sections of the tree. The inner heartwood, most of the time, is made up of living and dead. It's actually, it doesn't show, here, we have ray cells, and the ray cells actually can translocate. So a lot of people think it's all dead. A lot of it is, but a lot of it is actually living as well. So again, it's still able to translocate through the vascular system of the tree, which again is the xylem and phloem, through these ray cells as well into the heart. Okay, when we're talking about compartmentalizing, and the vascular system, this is a good example, because phloem is taking everything from the top of the tree, all of the sunlight, which then they create sugars and translocate it through sap. And then you have the xylem, which is bringing all the water and everything up through the roots. And so there is a complete separation. And this is what this slide describes. Again, we're talking about sugar that's turned into starch, that's stored. Certain trees have a greater storage capacity than others. Who can tell me of a tree that doesn't store very well? Anybody? Okay, so a lot of times softwood trees won't have storage capacity as well as hardwood trees. So a hardwood tree or a medium wood tree such as monkey pod is probably one of the best storage trees we have on the planet. It can store a tremendous amount of food in there, so it can go through a lot more hardships than maybe another tree like, say, poinciana, which is a softwood tree. Okay, region. This is kind of interesting because the elongation of root hairs. Just like he was talking about the apical meristem. Well, roots are very much like this, and there's this documentary out called The Revenge of Plants. And what was interesting that they posed in this documentary is they showed a root hair and it was cut, and they actually traced how the root hair actually developed. And for a root hair that was the apical meristem of that root hair was cut versus one that wasn't. And it actually really changed the way that plant grew. So that was kind of interesting. Okay. Where are most of the roots? Anybody know? Top. Close. Yeah. The reason the top 24 inches and out of those 80% are in the top 12 inches. You just don't have oxygen at lower depths. There are exceptions to certain situations like everything in life. If you're in someplace like Arizona, you might have some trees that actually have a taproot that can go down to sandy soil much deeper. But in general, you're looking at the top 12 inches of soil for most of the roots. And in this situation, when the roots expand, if you have a really rocky area, you'll start seeing them protrude out of the ground. So a lot of this is the buttress roots over here coming down, and you see, all of this. This is completely different than the roots that are actually underground, by the way. And for the roots, what's really important is structurally, they go out. They don't go down. So from a structural standpoint, that's how you can have trees that go 300 feet tall and can still deal with, 80, 100 mile an hour winds. The other thing that they do that we were talking about earlier is they store food. So, not to mention they bring up water and translocate up. And what is that called when we actually take water up from the ground and part of that vascular system? Anybody know? Okay, that's a xylem. So, where it's pulling it up through the leaves.
Which is really just the wood. I mean, xylem is a fancy name for wood.
Okay, mycorrhizae. they have a symbiotic relationship with the roots. So a lot of times, water itself, or funguses and bacteria, can be absorbed through these root hairs. So it's really important a lot of times for the fungus, the mycorrhizae here, to have a relationship with plants. And that's why, if you know that, why it's so important to actually use things like mulch, because they have high bacteria and fungus counts. So again, that's really important for plant health. Okay, coated. Compartmentalization of the tree's defense process. This is really important to know because this is the basic essence of when you're pruning a tree, how you'll damage the tree or how the tree will be able to limit itself from damage that you might do. So again, compartmentalization.
Which is a good example there, Mark?
Yeah, okay. Right here, you see this wall, this dark line here? Can everybody see that? You want to throw on the lights? Right here, you can see this dark line here. What it's trying to do is compartmentalize. And when you have a side branch, why they're saying, in a situation, like here, this was, the only major leader. But when you have a side branch, one of the things is on the side branches, the cells are denser. They're more compacted in that area. So it can actually limit the amount of decay in those areas. So it just does it much more efficiently than if you did an internode cut. Okay, thank you. And what this is describing is basically compartmentalization, how it's important to, in this situation, Steve showed that you have different countries and boundaries, and you don't want to cross into those boundaries if you don't have to, because they could be detrimental. And again, here we're talking about different sidewalls. You can actually have decay coming down as well as from the outside, and then these different areas are supposed to wall it off. Again, this can be limited. So in this tree situation, if we're going to be pruning, you would only go back to a lateral, like Jay was saying. You don't want internodal cuts like over here. You go right back, to the node or lateral. And again, it should have, like if we pruned it here, this would have enough foliage to be able to compartmentalize so it won't travel down here. And a lot of times it might go down to another lateral or sometimes all the way to the trunk. And once it does go down to the trunk, the tree is pretty much finished. Branch bark ridge. Okay, this is what we were talking about. Over here, what's interesting, there's much more straight ridge on the bottom and on the top. So here it's called the branch bark ridge. This is the little wrinkle area where the branch conjugates. And down here is the branch collar at the bottom section. So if you're dead wooding, instead of grabbing a hook and pulling down on this and then having it strip, a lot of times what you could do is just get your little hook and push up on it, because up here it's weak. So the strength on most of these branches are right over here.
Could you clip that on? Because you're going to be doing most of it. Technical break here.
So right here is called a crotch. And again, this is a branch collar and a branch bark ridge right over here. It's really important the angle of this, because if this was steeper, as this diameter increases, it will break it apart. And I have some samples of that right here that I'll show you. We have some other slides coming up that will show codominance. So when we're pruning, we're talking about now, since we basically know how most of these trees operate and the basic biology involved in them, here's an imaginary line. This is the collar right here, and you always want to prune right outside the collar. So over here, coming straight down, is where you want to cut. If you cut into here, this is the protective zone of the tree. You don't want to do that, because if you do, you stand a great risk of decay coming all the way through, whether it's a major limb, a scaffold branch, or the trunk itself. So if we were going to be doing the cut up here, then what we'd be doing is coming down this way. So this has to be at least a third of this size in order to have done a reduction cut on this. So again, what they're showing is an imaginary line through here for a proper cut. This is another good example over here. You see here, if we were going to cut, it would be right down here, like at that angle. Here, this is really, basically a flush cut. They cut off a lot of the collar. Yeah, it's too close. And again, you're entering the protective zone of the tree. Now, what happens if you do a good cut, such as over here, it will callus over. So this will callus over here. Over here, if it's not a good cut, this will decay and travel through here. It might callus over, but this will always be decayed. This is looking like it's closer to a flush cut, somewhere in between, not completely. But it is callusing over, and that's a good sign. So it's probably the angle of the photo. So once it calluses over, it won't do that with a flush cut. What will happen is you'll still have an opening right here. And that's when you'll start to see some decay, such as like over here. So this was probably left open as a stub up here, and by the time I got to it, it was pretty much done. But you could tell how it traveled through here because they left a stub, and then it traveled through the entire trunk. So again, a good example of that. Okay? Technical difficulties. Okay, mine's not working. Can you just operate it from there? Oh, you know why? Battery's out on this. Oh, here we go. No? See, it's barely. I think the battery's out. Okay, so while they're checking that out, you got it?
Well, I just did manual.
Okay.
Keep going and see if you can do it.
Let's see.
Make it up to
Yeah, mine's not working at all. Even my little pointer's not working. Okay, so again, this is an example where the end of the pencil is, the pencil tip is, what is that called? Yeah, the top of the collar is called what? Branch bark ridge, there we go. And that's what he's pointing to right now, the branch bark ridge. And this whole area, the top and bottom, is the collar. Okay, next.
Mark, want to use this as a pointer?
Oh, sure. Watch out for the fan. Oh, is there another one? Okay. Okay. What's really great about this is that it shows a pronounced collar. And when we go outside, oh, thank you. When we go outside, we're going to be working on some plumeria trees. And the great thing about a plumeria tree is because the collars are so pronounced. Some other trees, it's rather difficult to see exactly where to cut. So right here, you see how it actually tapers in a little? It almost, like a plumeria tree, when we go out, it might be easier. But it'll show you exactly where to cut. And you don't come down like this because, again, the collar is down here. So you go at an angle. So that's really important. This would be a flush cut. We'd be taking off most of the collar. So again, this would be a proper cut.
Further out, Mark, what's wrong with that?
Okay, if we go out here, then we'd be creating a stub. And remember, if we're going by ANSI pruning standards, which should be your bare minimum to work by, there's no way for it to get food over here, so you're not back to a side branch a third of the size or more. It's an internodal cut. Anytime we're doing a cut, should be back to a side branch a third of the size or more. Okay? Okay, in nature, monkey pods are a great example of this that we have in Hawaii. You'll see the branches break and a lot of times right back to where the collar is. They'll just, what they call natural pruning. They'll just drop the lower branches when they don't get enough light, and then, you know, the tree will be shooting branches all up here, and it'll just continue to go up. So again, this is where the collar is in nature. This is many times where it'll just, you know, fail from. Next. More examples. I know a lot of these are redundant, but it's really important for everybody to understand why we're doing what we're doing. Again, this would have foliage up here. This would be yes. This would be no because it's an internodal cut. This would be correct. Like on this, to be honest, I think it would be a little bit more of an angle like right over here. Same thing with over here, just slightly a little bit more over here. This, you know, if we were taking this off, we could go back to here because this is a third of the size or more. Just like if we were going to come down to here, if we were going to drop it, the height, we could come back to here. This would be, because this is a third of the size of this. Okay, three-cut process. The reason behind this is so we don't damage the collar. That's basically why they have a three-cut process. So if you look at the first cut under here, this is simply to prevent the limb from stripping down and damaging the final area, which is again our protected zone of the tree. So we do an undercut over here that's roughly 25 to 30% of the size of the branch or limb that you're taking off. The top cut is just to have it hinge off of this so it doesn't strip down, and that gets the weight off. When you do your final cut, it would come more of an angle down over here, not so much vertical, but again more of an angle over here, and that would prevent, you wouldn't have the weight over here. And so a lot of times you might have a really thick, like say you're taking this and you're only taking this much, but it might be 3 feet in diameter. You know, a lot of times what you want to do is cut from the bottom, and it might even pinch it, and then, you know, you put a wedge in things and then you can finish the cut. But what you don't ever want to happen is for, again, the collar to get damaged. And again, these are just, you know, other examples. This is actually when you have two branches the same size, of equal size, this is called codominant. You don't want this in general. It's something that should be addressed early on. If the space and the gap is, you know, pretty far apart, it won't create a problem as such. But as they get older, you see the diameters, like Jay was saying, they would expand. Then they're going to push each other apart, and then you'll get a strip right down the middle over here. So that's why, even if right now this doesn't pose a problem, if you get it young, remember trees can, like everything, get over it a lot better when they're younger. Over here, we're talking about thinning. So if we're going to be thinning and we have a lot of dense foliage, you don't have the airflow through and you won't have the sunlight through in many cases, and then you'll have more branches, you know, to crowd out. So you don't want crossover. So what they're actually showing here is to remove all the crossover branches. If you look at every one of these, it's crossing over another branch. By doing this, allows more light flow through here. What's also really important is you want a certain amount of foliage in the interior of the plant. And the main reason for this too, outside structurally it's good, and the plant can utilize more food by having more light coming through the entire plant. It increases better taper for the existing branches. The other thing is, if you don't have any of these lateral branches, when you take this off, you would have to go all the way back to the trunk. If you have lateral branches, you can just go back to there. It gives you another, you know, way of pruning it where it might not be so severe. Okay, over here we're talking about reducing. A lot of times for height clearance, we want to reduce. So what we're doing typically for roadsides is we're doing vertical pruning, going straight up over here. We're doing reduction cuts, so we're taking the top and bringing it down, or we're raising it. So we're taking some of the lower branches off, and then, you know, having where you have more clearance underneath the tree. So in this example, this is actually reduction cuts. So they're actually trying to, you know, bring these back. Okay, next.
You know, one thing, Mark, too, on the thinning cuts and the reduction cuts, any new growth, the differences there on the thinning cut, you're taking the whole branch, right? You don't want it to come back, right?
Right. Well, what we're trying to do is create more airflow, and it's crowded, and I'm sorry, over here?
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
You're taking all the way
yes.
back to the main trunk. You don't necessarily want that, any new growth there, right?
Correct.
But the reduction's got, the new growth is gonna come from hopefully, from the branch you're leaving, right, from 1/3 branch.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point, Jay. Thanks. So what Jay's saying is, over here, you're not going to have to worry about it when it goes back to the trunk area, the pruning, because most of the foliage is over here because that's where most of the light is. In this situation, you're just reducing all of these. So this area is still being left. So you're just reducing it over here. So eventually this will grow back. So thanks.
You're changing the direction of growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, heading cuts. This is what we were talking about earlier. Reduction of shoot stems and branches back to a bud or to a lateral branch, not large enough to assume a terminal role. This isn't ideal. This isn't something that is, but sometimes you have to do it because you're not left with any other choice. So sometimes you see this a lot like with shower trees, If you keep on going back to the same place, it's called pollarding. It's very popular in Europe. You don't see too much of it, locally. You do see a lot of it, I guess, with shower trees in parking lot areas and things like that. They keep on bringing it back to the same area, even though this might not be a third of the size of this. There's enough foliage, and they do it year after year to the same place. Okay? So over here, we're talking about pruning cuts, included bark. Okay, could I have the lights on for a sec? Okay. Out here, this is what we were talking about with codominance. What happens, this and this, as they increase diameter, they'll push each other apart. So what's really nice about this is it actually shows how it is cracking right here. And, it's a nice cross section that you could tell, the whole section over here is cracking and this is breaking off. This is a defect in a tree, so something to be really aware of. When we were talking about heading back some of the cuts, remember I was telling you trees never heal, they compartmentalize. So if you guys see this is all dead, completely dead when I cut this. This was all alive. So a lot of times you'll have living mass around here, but then all the new growth that comes in is weakly attached because there's nothing to attach to. This is dead. It's not going to come back, it's gone. So the amount of decay in here with time will just decay further and further. So it might look like it's structurally okay. It's not.
So what will happen to that?
So what will happen, and this is why we're in the highest death rate on land in America, is that this will actually seal over. It will callus over, but this will be, by the time that happens, will have decayed significantly more. So if somebody throws their lifeline on this, this will have a great tendency to rip because there's no connection. So this is why tree climbing is so dangerous. And it doesn't matter, 20 years later, we have the best equipment, out there. It's just trees fail. This is another great example of a bad connection, and maybe even a better one. This tree was all but dead, but with that said and done, you still had the outer area. Can you see that? This was a fairly big branch. Most of the tree was dead, but this 1/3 of it was still alive. And driving by 30 miles an hour, somebody would think there was nothing wrong with that. But if you look over here, this was gone. This is all dead wood. So the only living section was this one little section over here where you still had a lot of foliage connected to it.
Mark, even if that wasn't dead, that connection's never going to get any better.
Yeah, and it doesn't.
To the outer side of the wood.
As wood goes on, that inner area will just decay more and more. But what's really deceiving about it, here you could see it's going to actually form over this. And if this wasn't such a good example of so much dead tissue, it would actually callus over this. But the connection is less than an inch. And this is a big branch. So again, this is one of the things when you have tree failure and why it's so important not to top trees. Next. Okay, codominant. Codominant simply means you have two branches of the same size. This is what we were just showing you an example of. These two will break apart as the diameters increase. Again, you could see the split coming all the way down here. They literally split apart like a wishbone. Okay, this is again what we were showing earlier. You know, you start seeing where it can compartmentalize and everything. This is the bark inclusion. What happens, another defect. You know, it's included bark. It's very much like codominance as far as, you know, the bark is included. You have weak attachments. Again, it just fails. If you look here, look how many different leaders you have here. What do you think that's mainly from? Trees don't typically grow naturally where you have 5 major, anybody? Typically, you get this from topping. Okay, so a lot of times you'll see monkey pod trees, and they top the monkey pod trees, but remember, they're one of the best compartmentalizers on the planet. But even after they do that, they'll come back and they'll remove a bunch of these. So if you have like 5 in this situation, they'll remove this, they'll remove that. You know, they just might remove all the side ones and leave 1 leader. That's how they'll deal with it, because they know that with time this will be a defect. Next. Okay, bark stem ridge, again, included bark. This is not attached. So a lot of times you'll see, even in ficus trees, they'll fuse to each other. Those are more weakly attached. A lot of times people will think, you know, that it's fine. It really isn't. So with certain trees, like, you know, say a ficus tree, it might be really strong, but if something's going to fail, that's going to be where it's going to fail. It's when you have the included bark. Okay. Again, this is another example, you know, codominance. Okay, we're getting back to the same thing. 3-cut system. What's the bottom cut for? Very good. And the top cut? Yeah, we're trying to get the weight off. Yeah. And then again, you know, you would want to cut back over here. This is getting really close. So over here at a slight angle. And that would be your final cut. The main thing to remember, leave the collar intact. That's the protective mechanism of the tree. I know it sounds like my mantra going over and over, but it's really important to know. Okay, so here, what's a great thing, these are really much better examples. You see how the angle here is much better than some of the previous examples, like, you know, in the past where they were showing it kind of more straight down like that. Tree branches don't grow straight out like this, otherwise this would be a great example. They grow typically at an angle. So same with here. So here should be at an angle out, so like there, where this is a much more precise, better example of what a proper cut is than actually this is. You know, they're both really close, but if you see the top here, it didn't reach the outer portion of the branch bark ridge. You see that gap? Does everybody see that? Just stop me if I'm going too much into detail or whatever. I know it gets boring sometimes, but so anyways, this again is a protective mechanism of the tree. If you cut it properly like this, this will seal over and it will be fine. If you don't, an internodal cut like this, decay will come through here and you can kiss it goodbye. Okay, next. Okay, this is what happens with a strip. You know, this is a rip. A lot of times you'll get this, you know, with water sprouts because they'll be weakly attached. It was what Jay was talking about earlier too. You know, when you get a lot of fast growth, softwood trees have a higher tendency to fail than hardwood trees. And the reason for that is they grow at a faster rate. Hardwood trees create this layer system, and it works like carbon fiber. It's just, what Jay was talking about, the growth rings over here, and that's how you're able to date certain trees based on the growth rings. They can even tell based on the width of the growth rings what the weather patterns were at that time. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, as far as the strips go, something that should be avoided at all costs. The strip is basically the same thing as if you did a flush cut. In both situations, it damages the most important part, which is the... Very good, thank you. Okay, next. Okay, major strip. Bad news. You see how it's actually callousing over here? you still have this is severely compromised. There's a great deal of, weight up here. The problem with the bottom area, more so than a top, which you won't get strips obviously on the top, but the bottom area is, remember, where the strength of most branches and limbs are. It's not up here. The attachments are better down on the bottom. And again, that's why if this was dead wood, it's easier to push up than to pull down. Okay, next. Flush cut, rip below stub, injury to stem. This is again why it's important to not start off with a top cut. You always want a bottom cut. So here they did a 3-cut process. Remember, they did it so the bottom cut so it doesn't strip. They did the top cut and then back to the collar. Okay? Oh, can you flip it back to that? Because that's a really good example. Oh, sorry. Can you go back? No, we're going forward. Okay, well, we could just go with this. Okay, what I wanted to go back with that was kind of interesting. The place where the handsaw was cutting couldn't get the angle. So, lights, please. So, instead of going like this, where, if you were going to cut it back over here, it actually was like this. And because this portion was coming out, so you couldn't get the handsaw in there. In that situation, go from the bottom up. So I thought that's why that was kind of, I think it's the one before that. Why I thought that was actually, okay, so let's look at that one. Because that's, lights please. Oh, where did my little pointer go? Here we go. Okay, you see this? That couldn't be a proper cut because they're coming straight down. So it's a good example in this situation. You could have easily come at an angle here and start from the bottom going up. And again, like everything in life, it's the details that really count. And so, again, this is certainly the easier way, and this is the way that 99% of the time we do it. But in certain situations, think outside the box. How do I make a proper cut without damaging the tree? Coming straight down is not going to do it. By coming straight down, you not only damage the collar, but you create a much bigger wound. If you come at this angle, it tapers. You're going to have a smaller cut over here than you would coming all the way down here. You guys see that? Space from here to here is significantly less than from here to here. And you have a flush cut versus, a proper cut. Again, it's the angles. Okay, thanks, Jay. Okay, topping. Topping, the definition of topping, indiscriminate cutting limbs, branches, or trunks. They're internodal cuts. You're not cutting back to a lateral a third of the size or more. This tree, just looking at this slide, could tell you that it's been butchered many times in the past. One of the things to be aware of when you damage a tree, like I said before, it will never heal. So once you damage a tree, it's damaged for life. Why that might be important is because people that touch the trees, it opens you up for liability. So there's plenty of cases that 10 years later, whoever butchered the tree, several years later, the tree falls over, kills somebody, hurts somebody. They're going back to the person who was in that tree last, or who actually did the topping of that tree. So liability reasons you don't want to do it, but more so, a tree is the oldest living life form we have on the planet. And it should have the respect for that. Like Jay said, there's nothing that can duplicate what a tree does. I mean, it's not only creating oxygen for us, but everything from erosion control to food. So it is really important. Okay, so again, topping, indiscriminate cutting branches, limbs, or trunks. So you can top it by doing this, you could top it doing this, trunk, whatever. And again, just like with the grass, you don't want to cut more than 25% at any one time. You stress it out. If you stress out a tree, what's really unusual about it, it sends out a pheromone. That's why some of you might wonder, and then some of you might not, why insects attack certain trees and other trees not. And simply, when you stress it out like this, it's kind of like, a fish that's wounded in the water. It's going to attract predators, and insects will be one of them. So you'll get a lot of boar damage, termite damage, things like that. Next. Oh, yeah. from this point on, you're going to get all these shoots coming out, just like this was. You see how crowded it is? That's not a normal structural. These are all defects. These are all weakly attached. They're all going to fail in a storm or be more prone to it. This was the example that I just showed you. See how this over here, you know, you have poor branch attachment, usually occurs from heading cuts. When you're topping, it was just like I showed you on, you know, our little specimen over here. You know, it's only attached right here for the whole limb. So this is the only portion that was attached. All this bark is all flaking and it was dying off. Here, you have no bark because this is all dead. So it's just like in the slide here. It's only attached here. That might, in a lot of situations, you might not think anything about it, but I've been on different jobs where I was pulled in as a consultant, and I've seen a mango tree where an entire trunk, half of it broke apart because it was topped 20 years ago. So when it broke apart, the inside was completely hollow. And the owner told me, yeah, we had somebody that did a great job because they cut 80% of our tree down. But that was 20 years ago, so how could that affect us today? Well, if you knew the basic biology that trees don't heal, so this was all hollow, and then, you know, it just split apart. Next. Okay, this was a tree that was topped. There was no reason for it. It was in Kapiolani Park. Who knows? I'm sure, you know. The problem is, if you look at all these attachments, not only are they weak, but they're really close together. So all the, like right here, I mean, they're all touching each other. It doesn't look good. You know, it took a lot more time and energy to go ahead and cut half the tree down. And what do we have here? Yeah, I mean, isn't that great? So we're going to go ahead and then butcher this, and then we'll put a bench underneath. I wonder if there's anything else we could do to, you know, make it more reliable. So, yeah, right. Maybe put a dog park over here, right? So to fix this, it takes a lot of time and energy. If we're just going to go ahead and prune it, remember, here, we could have gone ahead and reduced the cut right back to here. We could have taken this, reduced it over here. You know, these, if you look at it, the funny thing about it is, you see, you have no laterals a third of the size or more. It's elongation of the limbs. This is typically one of these mutations you see when trees are topped. Again, this is a structural problem because if we're actually following ANSI standards of, you know, back to a lateral, that means to take this off, and a lot of these, you would have to come all the way back to here, which we should anyways because they're so crowded. You know, they're all going to break each other apart in a few years anyways. But they literally turn this job into be 4 times more difficult. And instead of just doing, you know, some light pruning, they came and butchered it. It's something that a headache you have to deal with for a decade plus to come. And that's not even saying in here, this still might be decayed for the rest of its life. So, you know, this was a very costly mistake. Next. This is how it should be done, okay? A good rule of thumb for pruning a tree, it's like a haircut. If you can tell that it was just done, it wasn't a good job. So if we're taking out 25% of the foliage through here, basically, we're just going ahead and getting rid of the deadwood, getting rid of the crossovers. You know, we might have some airflow through here. If the canopy is too thick, we might want some, you know, inner growth in here. So especially like say you're going to take this off, but there's no laterals because this crowded it out. Remember I said monkey pod self-prune? So what we could do, if we know this is going to be coming out, we could punch a few holes in here to allow light, so then we could have some laterals and something to bring it back to instead of coming all the way back here. So, you know, trees react incredibly slow. They're not like us. When you damage them, it might be decades before you see the results. Next. Okay. You know, not exactly a pretty picture, huh? This is just like the monkey pod we saw in Kapiolani Park. Somebody came by here, and the owner, a lot of times, you know, they think it's a good deal because you're cutting all this stuff off, so the tree's not going to grow back right away. What they don't understand is it's just the opposite. When you defoliate a tree, you increase the growth rate anywhere from 3 to 4 times.
Also, too, you might take a safe tree like this, and now you made it into a hazardous tree. So there's no plus. You're not saving money by doing this. You made it quite a bit uglier. Aesthetically, it's a complete eyesore. This is a hazard. Now you're going to have to pay somebody twice as much next year. You know, this, if it's the same tree, you know, you figure the guy came up and whacked here, whacked there, whacked there. 4 cuts, he was out of the tree. Boom, done. Okay? To do this, you probably have 30 plus cuts to do. Okay, so yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. At this point, the best thing to do would be to prune it right here at the basal root flare. That's the best thing to do. So again, I can't overemphasize how this should never be acceptable in any situation. Okay, go ahead. Trees have dignity. It's just like I was saying, it's the oldest life form. We need to take care of it. Most of the time, you know, I think we really underestimate the value of a tree. You know, I just, for the class, bought a mango tree, and I was shocked. I paid $100 for this little mango tree. But I'm thinking, well, when you actually think how much a mango costs, if you go down to the store now, and especially if you buy it at Whole Foods or something, that's going to be nothing. So this little mango tree, hopefully, you know, will be a cash cow in the future. This isn't something that is just a recent development. I saw this document over 100 years ago in Britain where in fruit orchards, penalty by loss of hand for doing this type of work. This was over 100 years ago in Britain. So topping trees is nothing that we always didn't know is severely bad. You know, a lot of times they would say a butcher did this, but a butcher actually has a skill. Next. Aerial lift. Okay, a lot of times we're doing, you know, vertical clearance. We're clearing things away for, you know, power lines. You know, we're using all different types of things like cranes. This is a root pruner. Why, you know, a stump grinder, a lot of times they use for root pruning is because these have carbide teeth that go around. What's really interesting about that is it cuts it instead of shreds it like a trencher, you know, or a big piece of equipment. Trees did pretty well before this thing was invented, you know, and so since this thing's invented, you know, they have some real issues they never really had to deal with before that. Okay, bypass pruners. I have some examples of these, and the loppers. Hand saws. These are pole saws. You know, they've had huge strides in the last 10 years as far as the blades. You know, the different brands have really increased it significantly. We'll get into pruning, you know, with the bypass, and we have the loppers. I actually have ratchet loppers. Something you don't see too often. Next. Okay, same thing, hedge trimmers. You know, this you really want to try to avoid using it on a tree. And I went to Japan to do work a few years ago at the time, was when you actually use a hedge trimmer for a tree, remember wherever you prune is where it's going to shoot out, right? Because the apical dominance, that's where it's going to be shooting out from. You have, basically trees are divided into 2 categories where it's decurrent, you know, something like a mango tree, and excurrent, like a Norfolk pine. So wherever you cut a Norfolk pine, it's not going to change it into a decurrent tree, where a mango tree is more of like a decurrent tree, like a giant mushroom. Okay, well, why that's important is because whenever you're pruning with a hedge trimmer is where it's going to shoot out from. So if you have a black pine, you're not going to have all those little areas shooting out. What you're going to have is this huge canopy going over, and then you're going to lose a lot of the branches. Remember I was saying, like with the monkey pods, how they self-prune? Typically trees do that because they're not getting light to be able to feed that limb. And they're very efficient mechanisms that if they're not going to need it, they're going to get rid of it. So there's no welfare in Mother Nature, you know. If you don't need it, get rid of it. Okay, machetes and axes, you know, these are not acceptable. With that said and done, you know, we all know we prune coconut trees with, you know, a cane knife. So Hawaii's kind of unique to that. If you go by the ANSI standards, this is actually illegal. So this isn't acceptable if you're going by ANSI standards. In Hawaii, it's one of those exceptions that we do. Okay, again, I would recommend everybody, reading the ANSI guidelines for safety. This is probably a good time. Can we throw the lights on? Okay. This is my carbide helmet. Sorry, not carbide. Carbon fiber. So this actually was a helmet I had a few years ago and got hit with a limb, and it's Kevlar is actually what this is. And that's the same thing that the military helmets are made out of, Kevlar. It broke through here. And needless to say, I didn't have a very good day, which my career seems to be filled with many of those. So if this was one of these plastic helmets, I probably wouldn't even be here today. So these, in both situations, are made to flex. So when you're testing a helmet, and most of the helmets out there are these. This is roughly 50 to 60 bucks. This is $250. You don't see too many of these, but at the same time, this I know saved me. If you look at inside here, the reason that this doesn't go all the way to the actual helmet itself is because it creates an amount of cushion. It's designed to break up, to disperse energy over a wide area. So that's the nice thing about the plastic, is actually made to disintegrate, much like the modern cars where they disperse energy over a wide area if you get in an accident. And then it's a throwaway. If you get even a spider crack, anything in here, you never throw this on the ground. This will save your life. This, it literally ripped out the rivets from the helmet. And again, this is what guys go into combat with, So this is what I was talking about earlier. Every time I have, earmuffs, I always stick in these, especially if I'm around a chipper. And even with that, I still am half deaf. And for our safety, if we're working around trees, it's really important to wear chaps. And I know they're uncomfortable and people don't really like them, but how these work is they're made up of a series of different fibers. So when the chainsaw hits it, it actually plugs the chain, stops it from rotation. It will still cut you, but it just won't cut you down to the bone. So, you're still going to have a bad day. But I've seen guys actually chew this up and barely, just some scratches, which is quite amazing. And, typically, I think these run about, $75, something like that. And it's something well worth it, and they last forever. So, quite a long time. Basically most of the safety equipment, like the helmets, especially if they're plastic, you want to replace every 2 years because, again, they need to keep that flexibility. That's what's going to protect you. So with this stuff, the fibers break down eventually. You can have them a little longer, but you do want to replace them occasionally. Okay. Lights, please. Okay. Crown cleaning, we're dealing with all these different things. Pruning to improve tree health and reduce risk. That's basically what we're all supposed to be doing out there along the roadside. So again, we're trying to, worry about things like, this little suckers coming up over here. We have the water sprouts like Jay was showing earlier, over here. You notice you don't have them down over here, right? That's exactly what Jay was saying. They're always on the top. You do sometimes see them, but it's not as predominant as you would see this. Dead branches, it's something to look for. If there's not a lot of, foliage on it, just start looking for cracks and things over here. Codominant. Look for this. Usually this doesn't become a real issue unless there's too much weight on each end. And then again, it will split apart. And also too, the distance between here when it's tighter, because then you'll just get a crack coming right through here, because this will push against this. Okay? So that should pretty much cover it. This is a really good example of if you didn't know better, you wouldn't know what was done, you know, the before and after. It's like I was talking about earlier. So if we're going to be, you know, doing a crown raising, we'd remove some of these lower branches. If we're going to do, you know, a crown reduction, we'd be removing some of these back to, you know, a third of the size. So, you know, these, same thing here with the clearance. If we're doing vertical clearance through here, you know, we might have to remove this and this, you know, or not be so aggressive and maybe remove over here and, you know, over here, you know. You want to try to make as little impact on the tree as possible. Okay? Okay. So what is the distance for pedestrians that the branch should be at? What? 7. For pedestrians, it's 7. For roadways, it's what? 17. So easy to remember because they're 7. So 7 for these guys, 17 for these guys. So that's something really important to remember. The other thing is too, you know, don't be within 10 feet of utilities unless you're a certified line clearer. It's not worth it. When electricity travels your body, it typically travels at an angle. And so guys making a connection, if it's my hand, you know, it'll probably blow out my toes or the heel of my right foot if it's my left foot making the connection. A lot of times they'll get a heart attack. It also burns your bone marrow. So even though you might be able to move your phalanges, you know, 10 days later they're amputating your arm. So again, it's something to take serious. Don't take a chance. Okay, next. Okay, good clearance over here, you know. We're able to get it off the roof at the same time, not destroy, you know, the aesthetics of the tree. At the same time, if you notice over here, you know, they raised it. They also did some, you know, vertical pruning over here. Okay? Okay, Shy goes, 90% of the time, 3 branches can remove and provide 90% of the clearance. So it's like what we were showing earlier. Next. Okay, with fronds, the main thing that we're trying to worry about are the coconuts, right? Because that's what's going to kill somebody. If you over prune a frond or the palm tree, what happens, you increase the growth rate. It's just like what I was saying when you top a tree. Remember I was saying 3 to 4 times the growth rate? Same thing with this. Like my own property, I have some coconut trees that I never prune because I want them to be low. I made the mistake 20 years ago having a client that had a coconut tree like this that was low, and she just wanted me to get the fruit off. It was only 10, 15 feet off the ground. 2 years later, that tree probably grew 3 to 4 feet in, you know, that year and every year afterwards. Once it started going, there was no stopping it. So, you know, you don't want to over prune this. If you do, like everything, you're going to stress it out. Next. Okay. Pruning to improve tree health and reduce risks. Safe, effective work plan. Engineer for approval. If you guys do see something that could be a hazard, it's important to act on it. And it doesn't necessarily mean if you're not qualified, don't go out there and try to deal with it, but at least let your supervisors know. And again, around electrical, if you're not, you know, certified to do that, don't try to do it because it really isn't worth it. How many people know how many guys died in Hawaii last year in the tree industry? Anybody? 4. 4 guys died last year. We're far above the national average, just so you guys know. How many police probably died last year? Last year. I guarantee it wasn't 4. So, oh, that might be mine. That wasn't. So, it's something to really, you know, consider. It is a dangerous line of work, and it's something that I can never emphasize safety, how important that is.
That third paragraph there.
Trees shall be completely removed to ground level as quickly as possible. Do not leave standing trunks more than 24 hours. Stump removals where appropriate 4 inches. Okay, this is something really good to remember. We probably all remember what happened out at Mililani, along the highway about 4 or 5 years ago, yeah? There were some big albizia trees that were cut down, and there was huge outcry. All the trees were a hazard. Nobody disagreed with that. But what happened was they topped them all, and they were thinking it was going to be efficient to just go ahead and top, and then we'll come back with the cranes and grab all the trunks. That's my guess, the theory behind that. What happened was everybody thought their trees were just butchered, and they thought that was the pruning. So that's why there was so much outcry about it, because not that the trees had to come down, they thought they were just being pruned. So it's a sad state of affairs for our whole state that, this is what sometimes the general public thinks, and that should not be the case. So when you're removing a tree, when you're dealing with the contractors or yourselves, remove the whole tree. Don't leave a trunk there for later on to come by and remove. So remove it as soon as possible. And to be honest, most of the time, nobody's even going to know it was gone, especially things like the albizas on the side of the road, or they'll be very thankful for it. Again, we're talking about unwanted trees and shrubs, act sooner than later. Okay, requires crown reduction, crown cleaning to include crown cleaning. Okay, so we all know the difference between actually pruning now and topping, right? So crown reduction. See all these little black? So if you actually follow these, the average person, again, would not know you did anything. Selective pruning, reduce height and spread of the crown. Not more than 30% of the crown of the tree. Some trees you can go 30%. Some trees you might not even want to go, 25 or 20. Roya poinciana is not a very good compartmentalizer. If any of you had to remove them, it's pretty hard to ever find one that's not hollow. They're really lousy compartmentalized. It's very soft wood trees that fall apart. So when you're doing this, you might want to take it in stages. And for us, what we try to do is we go, if you have a larger tree, it's okay to do it over several years. Don't try to take a 60-foot tree and bring it down to a 20-foot tree overnight. That might be something that takes a half a decade to do. Okay? Again, we're getting into proper pruning versus improper pruning. See over here, they were taking a big reduction cut down, but they still left the lateral. They didn't go into the collar. Same thing over here, you want to come right through over here. Outside, again, what's that called? What's this called, guys? Yeah, branch bark ridge, the collar. Okay. Okay, I think that was pruning, improve tree health, and then reduce risk. Okay. So we're doing, thinning out. Thinning out, we're trying to get rid of crossovers. We're trying to get rid of dead wood, open up the canopy a little, allow more light through. Selective pruning to reduce density live branches. Thinning should result in an even distribution throughout the tree. They're basically saying keep it balanced, guys. You don't want to cut half the tree off over here or straight line across. You got to go back to lateral. So even this, it should be more like this, even though we're reducing a significant portion of the size. Okay? Okay. If you're looking at this tree, if we're going to be doing the pruning, a lot of times, you don't want to plant trees too close to the buildings. But say we're trying to get it off here because of the extra trash or, the green waste resulting from the tree. It's kind of like what they were talking about earlier with Shigo, is you can just cut a couple branches off over here. So this one over here, you could cut it back to here if you have to. You can cut it back to over here. And this is coming this way. So this one branch over here would eliminate this entire vertical clearance right through here. And you can do the same thing, if you wanted to take a little off over here, if it's too close to the building, you could do the same thing on that side. Next. Okay. So sometimes, you know, the trees were here before the power lines, and so they have to make do with the best situation possible. And in many of these cases, you know, it might be best just to remove the trees. What we were talking about earlier, you know, again, it's not worth it. Again, we're talking about 10 feet. You know, nobody should be within the 10 feet. Over here, if you look at this, they've cut very few branches to allow the wires to come through. And that's what they were talking about, the 93-90 principle, that 90% of all your problems could be resolved with just 3 cuts.
One reduction cut there, you do that.
Yeah, right here. Okay.
Also on the right-hand side, same thing. Put off one side for any.
Okay. Again, we saw this earlier. What this is called is actually line tailing. So topping, we all know why it's bad. You know, again, it deforms the tree by having all these new branches weakly attached, too close together. They're going to split apart, and then it stresses out the tree because it doesn't have any foliage, so it opens it up for borer damage and termites and other things. And then everything from this point on will be secondarily weakly attached, even though if this isn't bad enough. Okay, what this is an extreme raising of the canopy. And this is called line tailing. Why this is really bad is because this opens it up to what they call a sail effect. Because there's no lateral branches. And by the way, if we're going by ANSI standards and say the next day after this we had to do a reduction cut, impossible. You'd be in violation of your contract. You could not reduce any of these unless you brought it back down to, you couldn't. Yeah, you would have to top the trees right here. So this would be impossible to correct. So they just really mess this up in the process of doing this. But why line tailing outside aesthetically it looks really bad and screws up the structure of the tree is that it actually makes it more prone for storm damage. Because how trees operate is when you have a lateral branch, it will counteract it in a storm. You don't have any lateral branches here. All the leverage is up here. The wind is going to cut right through here, no problem. But the wind is going to catch all this. And when it does, it's going to whip it around and it's going to twist. There's not going to be any side branch to counteract that. So in a storm, if you look at trees, and it's interesting because a lot of tree guys don't get it. They don't just do this like in a cartoon. They do this. They go back and forth. And it doesn't matter which way the wind goes. They, you know, fling back and forth. The next time we have a storm, you know, hopefully you'll remember this. And why that's important to know that that's how they work in a storm is because if you have lateral branches here, they'll counteract it. So when one's coming this way, the wind will catch it and then flip it back the other way. So it won't create, you know, a failure because these will twist and then these will break off down here. Okay? Okay, these are different ways that are efficiently to, you know, do roadside clearance. So, you know, we have the flail mowers, you know, with the arm coming off. And then afterwards, the ideal situation is to use this. And then, you know how, like, with, especially like this looks like it's all, what, how? So remember how when, you know, we use this, how it strips all the how? So what's really a good idea is if you can just come by and the major branches, you know, do proper cuts. Because aesthetically, it will look a lot better than 3 or 4 foot branches hanging down, stripped down over here, and everything dying from it. So again, it takes a little bit more time, but I think the general public really appreciates that. Same thing up here, you know. They're going for vertical clearance. You got to use an aerial lift to get up there. Okay? Risk assessment. If there is no target, there's no risk. Okay, if that tree we saw earlier that had all these defects, if that was in the middle of some forest, would that be a hazardous tree? No, because there's no, you know, there was no picnic branch over here or picnic bench and, you know, nobody walking through. So not a big deal. Okay, what we're looking for in this situation, deep open cracks and codominant. Okay, see over here? This might not necessarily be completely codominant because this isn't the same size as this, but this might have had too much weight on. There might have been some defects here. This might have had a bad attachment. Maybe it was topped in the past. There's tons of reasons for this. So what you're looking for are defects such as this. So cracks, you're looking for, the connections that might be weak, any sort of holes over here. These are things that you want to bring to your attention of your supervisor as soon as possible. Okay, this is included bark. So again, this is an example of codominance. So it actually, as it grows, you'll see, it'll start to swell up over here like a branch bark ridge. Okay, next. Okay, this is one that happened at the UH, and I guess, according to Steve, a lot of the maintenance people saw the cracks over here. It was a big kiawe tree, and there was all sorts of vines and stuff around it, and it added to the extra stress, and the thing just fell apart, and I guess damaged a car. So if you see these type of situations, you want to, again, bring it to the attention of somebody, a superior, as soon as possible. Okay, over here, trees with excessive lean. You'll be amazed on, you could have a fairly stable tree. At the same time, if you have targets, areas like roadways and things like that, if you have hillsides, especially if it's getting a lot of saturation, 30% isn't that much to flip this thing over. Even coconut trees. So not necessarily, your regular monkey pot or something, but if you see coconut trees, they move around far more. Like Jay was saying, it's basically a giant grass. So they're designed to move, to have a lot more flex. So monocots, they have these vascular bundles, which makes them far more flexible than just hardwood. Okay, broken limbs and branches, dead, these are all things that you want to look for. Defects, any sort of decay, dead top branches, dead trees, these are all things you want to bring to the attention. You see stubs like this, if you see overall the tree in decline, if it's lacking foliage, but normally that time of year it does have foliage, these are all things that should be red flags for all of you. Okay? Anybody know what kind of tree that is? Yeah, a big tree. It's an ear pod. Okay, so the second worst tree, it's an ear pod. So the second worst tree that drops limbs is an ear pod. These are very fast-growing trees, very soft wood. Albizia is probably the number one. The problem with some of these big trees that grow really fast is they have this thing called summer drop. And on a really nice day when there's no wind out here and we're hitting 90+ degrees, what happens is the trees dry out. And they have a tendency to drop limbs at that point. And I'm talking no wind, and albizas are notorious for this. All you have to do is go above Paradise Park and look, try to find one that doesn't have a giant limb. And by the way, these limbs are usually about 3 times the size of one, a normal tree. So when this thing comes down, it can really wreck someone's day. So over here, there were, quite a few dead branches that were 20+ feet long. And it's something that you definitely, not a place that you really want to set up a tent. Here's another great example. It's got to be 30+ feet long. And as you can see, a lot of this stuff doesn't have much foliage on, and that's the type of stuff that you want to look for. So I mean, if you don't see any foliage here, it might have, a lateral that is connected, and that's fine, where if you look at this, there's no lateral. Okay, next. Branch pull out. Okay, when we were talking about weakly attached limbs, again, this is something that when they top it, like over here, you have the new growth. I showed you guys a real life example. They easily pull off, okay? Albizia. These were all topped, and the new growth that happened, boom. This was a monkey pod, and the same thing happened. And that's really rare to see a monkey pod do this. But you could tell how it just went all the way down into the trunk. This is gone. Okay, weak branches growing rapidly. It's just what we showed on the shower trees a few slides back. You know, these grow at a rapid rate. They don't have lateral branches. They just go straight up, weakly attached, you know, more prone to break. Another great example. What a shocker. See how this was, look, topping cut, right? Okay, this died all the way back, just like we showed you. But look, there was a little connection way down here. Little connection. You know, what's that? Maybe 15% connected to a dead piece of log, you know? And this is something, you know, you see this at parks and things, and it's something to just be aware of. Because this could easily, like over here, this was top 2, but you see it grew over here, but you know this is still not a great attachment. So in this situation, you would want to take this whole major scaffolding branch all the way down. And same thing with this one. You can't do anything to, you know, alleviate this. The connections are bad, inside's all dead. Okay? Okay, what over here for construction? You know, there's actually site plans and things. Typically, when you're doing construction work, for every foot in diameter the tree is, you want to have a fence going 1 foot out. That's basically the national average. In Hawaii, you know, we get a lot closer because some of our trees are just tougher. So, but that's a good rule of thumb. For the diameter, every inch in this, you put out a fence 1 foot out. So again, if this is just a 3-inch, then you're going 3 feet out. Okay, fruiting bodies. This is another great red flag telling you you have decay inside. Can we have the lights on? I have a, thought I had it. Here we go. Okay, you might want to pass this around because in Hawaii you don't see this too much. It's not like on the mainland, but you do see it. And this is a fruiting body that actually attaches, you know, to a tree. I think this is a mango tree I took out years ago. But it's kind of neat, and it's just something to look at. But again, it's something to be aware of, because when you see this, it's usually because there's decay underneath. Okay, next. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend making soup out of that. Okay, lights. Okay, Steve does a lot of construction and a lot of consulting on the military bases. And so he was showing this because these guys can come in here. They took his barrier. See how far out it was? They threw it off on the side, and then they had to put a line in. And they do this so fast, and then when they're finished, so they'll rip up all the tree roots, then they'll go ahead, spread all the soil out, and 3 days later when he shows up, it just looks normal. But they ripped up half of the roots of the tree. So, you know, the protective zone will be back where it should be and all that. And, you know, it's just something good for everybody to be aware of. So, yeah, you know what, to be honest, I don't know. But I think he told, yeah, actually, this I do remember, he did take it out because when they excavated this. Now, the funny thing is, I think, Jay, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was only something like a 1-inch line or something. You could have easily tunneled under all of this, and it would have been less headache. You wouldn't have had to pay this big equipment operator all this money. But they actually have ways of tunneling through all this underneath the roots, because remember, the tree roots don't go down that deep. So it would have been no big deal to go 18 inches underneath all of these roots. Instead, they just devastated this, and then this tree, because they were going to build a building over here, they had to take it off because you already had a lean going towards the building. So when you eliminate the roots on the opposite side of the lean, it's not a good situation. Again, we're talking about fruiting bodies. You know, this is, you know, at the base of a tree. This is called the basal root flare. So when you see it down here, it's especially bad versus, you know, up on top on a limb or something. Another good example. There's quite a few trees that you're going to see this more so than others. And remember, a lot of the trees that are bad compartmentalized, there's silky oak, Royal poinciana, beech heliotropes, things like that, you know, are going to be more prone to trunk where the whole thing will just rot out. Okay?
What kind of tree is that?
Flip it back, please. Uh-oh. Yeah. We'll see. Okay, we're going forward. Yeah, we could just start right here. It's okay, Jake. So what we're talking about, I'd have to take a better look at it, but it probably was a monkey pod. I think one of them might have been a silky oak. Okay, right here. Yeah, it looks like a monkey pod. So over here, you know, it's decaying. I've seen this in a lot of schoolyards.
It's like that.
It means you have major trunk problems, which will definitely, it doesn't matter even if the roots are okay, which typically it's not. It's certainly a good indication at this area that you have major root problems as well. Yeah, see, this is a seal over. Okay, but what's interesting is I had a really big one, about 5 feet in about 4 feet in diameter. And what we did, from way up here, I got into the tree and we sent down a scope with a camera. And what was interesting, because it had fire damage, it was one of the little elementary schools in New Wano. So we actually took a camera and went all the way down there. But what we found out was the tree wasn't damaged as much from the fire, but they changed the grade. See here, you see the flare, basal root flare? That's important to always look at. So, you know, they're showing some examples of, you know, things that are real red flags, but also things like this. So the big tree that I was talking about didn't have a basal root flare. I sent down a camera over here. They changed the grade by 5 feet, like 30 years ago. So the whole giant tree was hollow. And it's still there to this day. But I had to document everything, gave them a percentage of what I thought. The tree is, you know, well over 100 years old. But it's this big tree that's hollow. And they thought that it was, you know, okay. But, you know, I sent the scope down, and I, in my report, explained that they actually did a back grade of 4 or 5 feet. So that's,
4 or 5 feet at the bottom.
yeah. And that's what created all the hollow spot, not the, you know, building that caught part of the tree on fire. So the risk from the fire damage was actually, you know, it was one of those things where I would have, you know, it can deal with it, you know, it would recoup. Because again, these are really, you know, some of our local trees are unreal. And, but the problem was, when they changed the grade, that's what the tree was going to, you know, fail from. Okay? Okay, broken cracks and branches. Again, some of these things are redundant. It's, again, they're really trying to emphasize, you know, keep an eye out for these things. And a lot of times, you're going to see these up on, you know, they'll be on top, so you're not going to really see them so much down below. This is girdling roots. This is what happens in many cases when trees are root bound in pots. So when you take them out and, you know, in fact, I'd be surprised if the tree we plant today is not going to be root bound. So again, why this is bad is because the roots will wrap around it and strangle. Where's the vascular system of the tree? Not everybody at once, guys. It's on the outer, remember, just under the bark. So when you have this wrapping around, these roots are going to increase in diameter, and so will the trunk. You're going to strangle it. And that's why I know a few years back, Gentry had a nursery out in Mililani. They had over 1,000 Norfolk pines. They had to cut them down because they were in roots, or the pots, they were root bound for so long. So nobody wanted to even buy them. So the whole nursery, they cut everything down. So because they all had girdled roots like this. And with the Norfolk pine, because remember, it's X-current. It goes straight up, and it's not uncommon. They hit, you know, 120 feet with those. So this will strangle out, and the whole tree will topple over. So again, this is why it's really important to be aware of this. And there's a tree right outside here when we go out. If you have a tree that needs to be wired up or supported 5 years after it was planted in the ground, or 3 years after, this might be one of the big reasons. And you'll see this with everything from little hibiscus shrubs that I saw in Waipio to, you know, giant trees tumbling over, and you'll see this. So again, when you're, you know, we'll get into this outside. Next. Now this, same thing, but this might be caused from something different. And you'll hear about like mulch. You know, it should be 6 inches from the base of the tree. What happens a lot of times, they'll create these volcano things and they'll come over here. You will stimulate the growth over here of the roots, and it will actually create this girdling effect. So when you're doing mulch, you want to be outside the area, out over here, so you're not only decaying the trunk area, but you're not stimulating the root growth right at the base of the trunk, because that's not where we need it. We need it way out here, not over here. Okay? Okay. You see what that does? Yeah, and just so you guys know, I've seen, not with roots like this, but guy wires where this whole thing then just breaks off right from this point. So major defect, and this is just from girdling roots. Okay, tree risk assessment, be aware of. You know, anytime you have any sort of decay, you know, it's something to keep an eye on. You know, whether it's up here, here, or here, but especially at trunk areas, you know, it really is important. Okay, looks pretty good, yeah? Not so good. So, you guys know what this is from? Yeah, that famous local disease, charcoalitis, you know? So this is where they had the hibachi or whatever, and they just throw the, you know, all the charcoals right here, and this is what happens. And that's, surprisingly, you see it all over. And especially, you know, to the point where we even have charcoal pits all over our parks now. Okay, hourglassing. You have penciling, which is a defect, and so is hourglassing. Hourglassing is less so of a problem than penciling. Penciling tells you with a palm that it's under decline and continuing. This it can recover from. Okay, one of the things that I noticed from climbing trees with cocos and things, you have one, based on the percentage, it might not be a big deal. You have 2 or 3, it is a big deal. And the reason for this is caused from some sort of stress in its lifetime. Typically from transplanting, a lot of times when they over prune, they'll do this too. Most of the time it's through drought conditions. So this is telling you it's just on its way out. As time goes on, it just gets thinner and thinner and eventually just dies. So, correct, yeah. The diameter just keeps on getting smaller and smaller.
That's because it's continuing to happen.
Correct. Where this it can recover. And again, why you see, there's no way, you know, like Jay said, it's very difficult for palms to actually get larger. It can happen. I've seen it with royal palms and manillas, but with the exception of that, I haven't seen it with other palms where this will actually change diameter. Okay, next. Okay. This is, if I'm not mistaken, did you do the slide? Oh, okay. I think this, because if I'm not mistaken, I even actually do that tree. So over here, it really tapers in, and I think this is in front of Chris's house, actually. So anyways, it tapers in here, and you see it's pretty normal up here. So see how it's fat? It just recovered. It was under a stress condition. It was transplanted during that time. It hourglassed. You know, if it got tighter, this might be more of a problem. Or if this, you know, becomes a 120-foot cocoa, yeah, of course this is going to be more of a problem because there's more leverage and wind up here. Because remember, these things will sway back and forth, you know, where a tree won't do that. Okay? You see over here how it swells up? Now how it's penciling in? Okay, this isn't going to recover. When it's penciling in, that's it. Okay, you guys know where this is? Okay, Blaisdell Arena. Remember years ago they used to have all these? So yeah. Again, this is under stress conditions. So when, you know, it could be construction over here. They could have gone ahead and cut all the roots doing a new sidewalk. It could be that the irrigation was off for a long time. I mean, there's a ton of reasons that this occurs. But, you know, back then we didn't have an aerial lift to do these, just so you guys know. There was none on the island that was tall enough to do that. So somebody had to go up over there, and this is the pucker factor right here. you know. Okay. Okay, this is it the Halikoa, the military hotel? Yeah. And what was interesting, Steve thought this would never come back, and he said they actually did. So Royal Palms, you know, he didn't think that was possible. Okay, next. Reducing individual shrubs. Okay, we're getting into, you know, removing indicates certain branches. We kind of went through this. Again, this is the same thing, even whether you're pruning for a tree or for a shrub. Your hand pruning, you're going to be able to go longer for hand pruning than you will using a hedge. Remember I told you guys my story about in Japan? All the foliage on, when you have something like this, on a formal hedge, this is all done with, you know, a hedge trimmer. All the foliage will be on the outside. You're going to have nothing but wood in here. We all have seen mock orange hedges, right? You go 3 inches in and there's not a single leaf. Okay, when you hand prune, you want light penetration, so you're going to get that all the way through. So that's a huge plus. Now what this is telling you why it's correct, you want 2.5 to 5% at an angle more like a pyramid like this instead of a glass. The reason for this is because light can penetrate down here. Light can't penetrate through the base of this one because it's creating a shadow effect, because it flares out. You guys see that? Okay. Okay. Okay, report time, effort spent, pruning, report any safety. These same things that we, you know, discussed earlier. Details on reporting and inspection are in chapter 14 and 15 of your maintenance manual. It's important to, you know, reference that whenever you have any questions too. Okay? We're going to go right into planting.
Yeah. Let's take a quick break.
Okay.